we did do an update towards the end of the year, so this isn't going to be drastically different information. We do have a few more incidents or events that we added in, but mostly we're going to talk about kind of where we are with our changes to our bullying policy and where we are with the implementation. So we adopted the new policy in January of 2024. In February, we rolled it out to buildings. The intention of the new procedure is to offer transparency, consistency, and collaboration. As we got our family engagement surveys at the end of the year, that just validated that this is work that we need to have like a universal system around, that we need to be doing this, handling it the same way in every building, that we need to have a transparent process that's collaborative, and that we're really communicating with our families regarding how an investigation is going and what following up on the aftermath. Like, that's really consistent feedback we received across the district. So our new policy should really push into that. But we are kind of in a state of transition right now. So this year we came with, and I'm going to tell you right now that I believe this is an underreport, because prior to this new policy, we were measuring the number of incidents that were determined to be bullying. What we're now going to be reporting is the number of complaints that every school receives. So anytime that a family or a student alleges bullying, it triggers the investigation process, where again, we're going to have that transparency, consistency, and clear communication. So I'm going to caution that these are probably an underreport of the number of complaints we've received. And again, our new process should help with that. At elementary, we had 6. At middle school, we had 11. At high school, we had 5, for a total of 22 in the district. Again, from feedback that we've received from families, I think that does not totally align with what the families perceive. Some of that is around understanding the difference between conflict and bullying, which again, our new process and procedure is going to support helping families to understand the difference between those two things by law. Any questions about that? So our reflection was that, again, our new procedure is going to give us way better information so that we can adjust accordingly. It's likely that we're going to see an increase in numbers as we're increasing, that we're actually tallying all the complaints that come in and following up on them. That does naturally level off at some point, but for now, it lets us be really responsive to families and to help to educate them, but also to validate the concerns that they have. The consistent process will address that need for transparency and communication that we're seeing come across in our family engagement survey. So the next steps we've identified, we did hire an elementary behavior specialist to support all elementary schools in problem solving and supporting all of our learners. So one clear concern that we saw across elementary last year was an increase in some of our more disruptive behaviors, and us not having a huge tool belt for how we're supporting those kids and managing those in a way that's both helping that learner to understand how to be successful at school, but also making sure that everyone else is feeling safe. So we've hired someone who is a certified PBIS trainer, certified in restorative practices. He's certified in COMP, which is a program for classroom organization and management procedures. It's a really useful tool for teachers to understand how to make their classroom space and their structures as beneficial for all kids as they can. We've got the new policy in place to ensure that we're collecting data around all of our bullying reports, investigations, and outcomes. And then we're making sure that we're communicating with families the location of the process so that it is accessible to them, so they understand what their expectation is when they have a complaint. That's all I got for you. I did bring some excellent backup singers. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have specific to how it's being implemented at buildings and their understanding of it as a universal practice across our districts.
You said something about families understanding the difference in conflict and bullying. Mm-hmm. Would you mind defining that for us, what the difference would be? So
there's sorry, that we have a slide deck that has this.
I'm sure I don't want to double.
Right.
Because it really is you're right when you say it's the biggest concern about our families.
For sure it is. So the idea that bullying assumes that there's someone has power over someone else, right? So if it's a bullying versus a conflict, in a conflict, two people have an equal amount of power. In bullying, somebody has power over someone else, whether it's that they have actual authority or they have social capital, like it could be a variety of things that give them that power, but that's one necessary component. So that is, I would say, the biggest difference.
Yeah, and the other piece on bullying is that there's a repetition of the behavior, right? So sometimes we have, we have to address conflict as well as bullying because
Right.
neither one is okay.
And that
right?
question,
Yeah.
we respond to this differently.
We respond differently if there's a repeat pattern of behavior that's creating an imbalance of power. That is true bullying, and that has those very real and long-standing effects on the bully and especially the person, the victim being bullied. So, but sometimes we get a report of my child is being bullied. And it's last weekend we were friends and this weekend now we're not getting along, or, we had a conflict at recess that still needs to be worked through because
Yep.
somebody said something unkind, or because the end result of the conflict was someone went home and felt bad. But there's not a repeat pattern of behavior where there's an imbalance of power and somebody is gaining power by making somebody else feel smaller. They're just two kids who happen to not be getting along in that particular moment, and both need addressing, right? And so for our families, sometimes they'll say my child is being bullied, and they'll say, well, they're being bullied by 10 or 12 different students who aren't in a group doing that to the student. It's just kind of conflict that's happening over and over and over again. So then we have to really work on the teaching side of how do we teach the kids to speak to each other and to engage with friendships and do all of those kinds of things, because there's some missed components to that sometimes.
And sometimes when kids are being mean, like, right, that being mean is not necessarily bullying. It is likely conflict, but sometimes it's being mean. And then it's about how are we addressing it as a community? How are we building that sense of community? How are we working on the interpersonal relationships and their ability to problem solve when somebody is saying something that's unkind or that they don't like? So finding those moments where, like, our SEL specialist or our counselor is going in and working with that group to help them figure out, like, how do they find a different way to communicate so that it doesn't feel like one student is being, ganged up on.
So then, in the numbers that you had up, those are the actual times where we deemed, yes, that's bullying.
Yes.
And then we also keep track of the number of times parents say my kid's being bullied, whether it's conflict or
So
bullying.
that's what our new process puts in place. We had not done that previously, but the new process that the board adopted in January puts that in place. So yeah, we have a really specific procedure. And it is collaborative between, like, the building leader or the student services personnel and the family.
And I think, I don't know who wants to speak first, but our principals can also kind of share a bit of sort of a case study on like what they do when something gets reported and then how we're following it through. Again, right now, when we say, hey, I've got a parent who's reporting there was a situation of bullying, I'm getting a lot of, oh, yep, we investigated that and we dealt with it, but we're working on making sure we have all the forms filled out every time so that we really can sit down with the family and then say, okay, we've looked into this and this is where things are. What does your child need so that they don't come back to school continuing to feel that way? We still have to do that part of the work and be really clear with parents. Sometimes we're not always circling back to the family to say this was the result of our investigation. So then there's a little lack of clarity around kind of what happened sometimes, or that's just a verbal conversation and not written, we're not sending something home in writing. So then when the family comes back, when there's another incident of sometimes it is bullying, sometimes it's just conflict, the family is saying, well, you didn't even address it the last time. So we've got to do a better job of, if you don't write it down, it didn't really happen, right? So we're working on that. And
Maybe the bigger concern a lot of families isn't necessarily bullying, but it's if they feel the school didn't do anything due to the
Right.
bullying.
Correct.
That's what you probably want to hear.
Right.
Right.
That's why we want the process that's consistent between schools and that we're using every single time. So that a family has that clear follow-up and they get to see the resolution of whatever was happening, but also so that we have records so that we can figure out if we're seeing something emerge. Like, that also supports our implementation of our EMLSS system, right? That when we're seeing that a kid might be doing something similar, but to different kids, like, it's not a pattern of bullying, but it's like they're struggling with a certain skill about social interaction or handling self-regulation, then that's a kid that we want to come at with some extra support to help them develop that skill. So the documentation is going to support us being able to support everyone who needs that little bit of extra help or beyond. Do you guys want to share a little bit about?
I can, a couple of things, just on the process that we
Can you-
submitted.
Sorry, Jim, do you guys
No,
mind?
I
moving
can-
up? Yeah, that way it'll be the cameras. We want the community to hear that we're taking this seriously and we are making all kinds of plans to address it.
Actually. Taller. Yeah, so I think everything that has been said, not having a consistent process across the districts. We know that these behaviors happen. Do we have cases of bullying at the middle school? 100% we do. There, I mean, to say that you don't in any school is, would be untrue. But in terms of the investigation and that process of really documenting step by step along the way, I think we were doing a lot of those things, but where we probably fell short was the follow-up and the resolution piece with all parties involved. It's something that we're continually working on with our kids, trying to educate kids and families around what is and what isn't. You know, kids being mean isn't necessarily bullying. So during that second semester, we did a better job of utilizing the paperwork and the documentation piece. But we have some areas, some room for growth there. On the front end, though, the more proactive piece, talking about building community, we made some changes coming into this school year. As some of you know, we used to have houses in all 3 grade levels for years. And then with some scheduling things, we just had houses in 6th grade. We're going back to houses in all 3 of our grade levels. And part of it is that is how we can start to develop a sense of community and develop community within a group of kids. Having a group of teachers have all the same students. And when you start seeing some of these patterns of behaviors with kids that all of your teachers that you're working with have, being able to plan and sit down and actually put in some action plans and some different things to help build those skill sets in all students. So we're doing that across all grade levels. We're bringing in CREW this year. CREW is kind of a philosophy and a framework specifically to develop school culture and climate through in like an advisory time. So we've always had like home base, or we're calling it Rocket Crew now, Rocket Crew. And so that it's going to be intentional. Every day there's a piece that's very intentional, setting goals and academic goals. There's also going to be one day of the week that is specific to building and teaching the skills, right? How do we interact with one another? A lot of that is done through just games. Kids don't play games anymore. Like just plain old board games, card games. They don't do that. And as we think about when we were kids, we used to do that quite often. We were playing board games and you had to learn how to, you had to learn how to lose. You have to learn how to win. You have to learn how to interact with each other. And so just utilizing those types of strategies within an advisory period of time of Rocket Crew to really start building those skills, because kids don't play games like that anymore. And we learned a lot of how to interact with one another as human beings at a young age through those types of activities. So those are some of the pieces that we're doing kind of on a proactive end. To again, it's about building community. How do we interact with the people within our community? I'm done.
I think like similar at an elementary level, a focus at the elementary level for us has been work around identity development, leading to classroom community development, similar to the crew setup you have at the middle school. And then looking at how those classroom communities come together as a school community. And so there is a lot of proactive work that happens on the front end, our development of common language throughout the building, some intentional instruction integrated into our early grade levels around some of our social emotional competencies. Really excited to begin our work with restorative practices, which the front end of that work, the year will be spent really looking at how we develop the relationships in the community that we would potentially need to resolve conflict within. And so those proactive pieces, I think, will help go along with this process. Process, in my experience in the spring, has brought a lot of transparency that I think is needed, and I think we would all agree that, the forms provide a way that to communicate back and forth with families, also with, across other district leadership positions, so that we can assure families that, you know, these things were looked at objectively and that this wasn't the perception of one person. I know, I think across all three of our buildings, we involve our student services in the process. Because it's difficult as a building administrator to be kind of the judge and jury in the same situation. So bringing in another set of eyes or asking for support from Carrie to basically take a look at what's being reported to determine, you know, whether or not, what course of action we need to take. Knowing that conflict occurred, but understanding the appropriate response to it, and how it fits within the policy, and the definition of what bullying is. So that has, I felt that like the initial form, the reporting form has been especially helpful. It gives us an opportunity to sit down with parents. And again, this is relatively new, so I look forward to like really being able to implement it going into the fall. But coming to consensus around all the different aspects of that form, rather than leaving some of that undone or left up to some wondering, you know, that is where I think we find ourselves in some gray areas or in some trouble. Because we're not necessarily saying the same things on the front end. So then all of, you know, the interviews and all the pieces that happen after that aren't necessarily built on that like shared understanding of what actually is being reported.
Well, and I think part of it too is, I think all of us as building administrators can probably, we probably said this to each other a million times. Part of it too is the education of our community as well, what is and what isn't, right? And really having many conversations with Carrie, like this process really is a great way to actually start educating the community on what is and what isn't. If you go through the entire process, and it's extensive, it's time consuming, so there's a lot of front end work that goes into this. But over time, as you do this more often, you're educating more families on what constitute bullying, what does it really look like, and was this bullying or was it not bullying? They may not like the results, but you can't say then that we didn't go through the process and they weren't part of that. So I think
to address it. No
Yeah,
matter
absolutely.
what the concern is, but I think a stumbling block for us has been people getting really caught up on they want to know what happens to another student. And what we need to do is be really consistent. And this is our process. This is what you have the right to know as the family who made a complaint. And we have confidentiality around the way that we manage any behavioral situation, right? Everybody has a right to some privacy and protections around that, but making sure that they're feeling that their concern has been addressed and we have a plan to move forward, regardless of whether it is in fact a bullying complaint or a conflict or, you know, whatever the situation may be.
And what's difficult is sometimes the strategies we try, they don't work, right? We're going to try something to eliminate whatever is happening that makes a child, whether it's bullying or the conflict, we're going to try different things to get that resolved and to get it to end. There are times where the strategies we try just don't work. And so on the parents' end, it looks like we didn't do anything and we really can't necessarily communicate all of the details of what we were doing with the other child or other children. And so sometimes that it's like not having that, like, I want to know what exactly did you do? What punishment or what consequence did they get? And you can't necessarily get into all of that. So it's the continual process of communicating with families. And when something doesn't work, we need to try something different. So if you remember the discipline chart we have in our handbooks, it's somewhat progressive, right? There's things that you can try that are on the lower end to try to resolve conflict or a situation, and it can progress from there.
And that's part of what the intent training around restorative practices as well, because there is a really intense mediation process through a really well-trained facilitator. As Carrie mentioned, our new elementary behavior specialist, he's trained as one of those facilitators, so that should this continue to escalate, or we have a couple of situations that really are perpetual between a few students, then you bring in both families, you bring in the students, you come to a resolution and you end it with a signed agreement sort of like a contract that the students agree to, that the families can support, because we really do want our families and caregivers involved in that. But right now, this year, we haven't had anybody who has been trained, because it takes a pretty high level of facilitation to bring all those people into a room and come out with a resolution. And it's a significant amount of time. So you do a lot of pre-interviews with both parties, then you interview, everybody commits to some norms, and then you come together for a good chunk of time to try to resolve something should it continue to escalate. So we're working really hard to make sure that we're adding the right training for staff as well, so that they know, hey, if you hear, if anybody says to you, my child is being bullied, or there was a situation of bullying, we don't decide for ourselves, no, it isn't. We refer it to the person who's in charge of investigating it thoroughly. And then the teams know, whether, like Nick shared, that it was, sometimes it's the student services person. It's really whoever has the closest relationship with the victim, because you don't want to re-victimize that person in the interview process. But you collect information from the person who was bullied, from the person who supposedly did the bullying, anybody else that was around and witnessed what happened. And then you look at the actual like criteria of each one and determine what it was. Occasionally, it could be something that escalates all the way to like a Title IX investigation, right? If in the course of the investigation, you find out, oh, this crossed a few lines that we didn't quite anticipate, and then that has its whole own process of investigation. But again, then circling back to say, okay, it was conflict, so this is what we did. That written documentation, right? To say to families, hey, after the investigation, it was determined that that was a conflict between two peers. Here is a list of the things that we are going to work on our end to make sure that that doesn't continue. One of the biggest challenges for us is the amount of things that happen on social media that is conflict between kids who both attend the same school, or can be real cyberbullying. It's very serious and harmful and intentional. And so those lines of when it's school's job to work through that whole process versus when a family should refer something to the police because it happened outside of school, not on our devices, not on our Wi-Fi. That's also kind of challenging, right? Because people will say like, well, we can't get the other student to stop, cyberbullying us online. And we don't have control over what they have access to when it's not at school, or when it's not, on the weekends or whatnot. And so that's also an added challenge to the whole thing. When it spills over into school and becomes a problem at school, of course we address it. But we also sometimes have people with the expectation that we have the capacity to mediate something that happened outside of school, online and things like that. And that's just goes beyond the scope of what we could possibly manage at school sometimes.
It's like that though, because like I get that if it happens outside of school, it can't always.
Yeah,
Like, that's the way that we would if it happened in school, but if you brought two dogs into a building, they're gonna fight, you're gonna keep those dogs away from each other.
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
Maybe that's
so
not the best example, but
to get the issue resolved first and foremost, we tell the families that they're welcome to refer to the police. Our police department has some pretty strong policies. Our city has some really strong policies around anti-bullying and cyber incidents and all those kinds of things. So the police have been super helpful to many of our families who have followed up with complaints to the police, and the police will follow up. If the parent reports to us that that happened and then the child needs a safety plan, then we sit down with that child and we create a plan for them at school.
And Andy, like, we don't brush it off.
No,
Because
never.
I wasn't this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I'm really- what-
what
Yeah.
we try to do is we do inform, like, we try to make the families really aware, like, this is not necessarily a school issue. Like, we don't have a lot of jurisdiction of what happens in social media outside of school. But we know it impacts a child's experience while in school. So we let families know that, we can have conversations, we can let them know we're kind of aware of these things. We do sit down with the kids, we do call the other families and say, hey, these are some things that we're seeing or we're learning about in terms of happening out on social media. Make sure you're checking your child's phone. We encourage you to do that, be involved in how they're interacting with their devices. And then we kind of we will keep an eye out. If we see some things start to, impact the school day, there's some things that we can do. We can, change some classes, make sure they know classes together, those types of things. We've made plans where we've agreed that the students have to use separate hallways. And when you're going from this class to this class, this is your only route. This class to this class this is your only route, to try to minimize the times that they would run into each other in the hallway. So like we still get involved, even though we don't have a lot of jurisdiction of let's say from a school-based consequence perspective, right? There's not a whole lot we're going to be able to do until it creates significant disruption into the school day. So we try to be proactive on that on the front end, so that we don't have to deal with something that now becomes a significant disruption to the school day.
And anytime we have a student who doesn't feel safe for whatever the reason is,
Yeah.
we provide safety measures at school,
Mhm.
right? Safe places to go, breaks if they need them, finding trusted adults, right? Because there's a variety of reasons
Yeah,
that
I
could
will-
also be happening that may or may not have anything to do with
Right.
school. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
I will just say that as some of these things are brought to our attention and we have conversations with both families, I think what we do is we come to light that a lot of things aren't one-sided. I, as a parent, might be getting my child's side of the story. And I'm missing some of the details in their participation in some things. And so it's just, what I try to do is work with families saying it, like, make sure you're, understanding how your child's interacting with social media, understand as best you can the types of social media apps that they're using, how they interact. Check every once in a while, just scroll through your child's phone and just kind of see how they interact with other people online. So because I think sometimes our parents don't have an awareness of how their child is in the online or social media environment. I think everybody has kind of a persona that is face to face, and I think some of our middle schoolers they have this other persona in their social media world. So it's just educating families and just making sure that they're part of their child's life.
Along the same lines, then it sounds like you're doing a lot of communication with the families within the middle school level, but then how is that communicated from elementary to elementary, or elementary up to middle school to high school? Because you could have a 8th grader bullying a 6th grader. Yeah, that kid's gone the next year in the 9th grade, but then they're gonna see him again eventually. And then how do you track that?
Well, I think that's part of the reason.
Part of why we brought
this
the new
process.
process into place is so that we can ensure, so every report will come to the building leader or the student service person, and also to me, so that I have some awareness of patterns of behavior that are emerging, and so that as we have students transitioning from one environment to another, that we can share, like, hey, this is something that we've worked on with student, this is a plan that we had around this student, this is some, extra assistance or support that this student requires because this was happening. So some of that is about like updating our process and making sure that it is really consistent, and that even when we think something might not be a huge deal, when a kid is in 3rd or 4th grade, that we have some documentation around it so that we know, so that as something else emerges, we have some historical data.
And if the events turn to be something more significant and bullying, those are things that we would enter into our Infinite Campus as like a major behavioral issue. And so those will follow the child through our system. So I can see any Infinite Campus entry on behavior that's entered at the elementary school. High school could see everything that we've entered as the middle school and elementary level.
I can add to, first of all, I want to apologize for my tardiness, so thank you for allowing me to slide in a little bit late. One of the really big functions that I see is we're preparing for the beginning of this school year, and to bring some awareness to our staff is really the function that it serves for the family. Nick talked about it before, about how we try to do a number of things proactively to build community and for our students to see the assets within each other. I think this is a really strong practice because I'll say the infamous line is, nothing was done about it, right? And so this allows us to exercise some empathy and sitting down and telling a parent, tell me what your kid's experience has been. A lot of times we find a parent can feel helpless, right? They may not have the whole story or context. And I think many of us as parents are trained to say, how was your day? And tell me. And unfortunately, like the really powerful emotions that can stick with it is using some of that terminology and what's happening without some of the context. So as we sit down with families to start going through this, I see it as an asset for me as a principal for them to give us some direction so that we can conduct an investigation with some efficiency. So there's boxes here about like location, where it's happening, so that we can hopefully understand the full scope of things. And it provides us with a basis to not only come back with a resolution or next steps. But then as Carrie was saying, I think it's a really great opportunity to educate our community at large about what equity means in a behavior lens, right? How we're supporting students in scaffolded supports. And I think you ask families for grace and saying, you know, we're working in knowing that each kid is where they're at, and we have a plan for them, and our staff is aligning those to those supports and resources. So I see it as an advantage for us going forward.
I think the other thing that, just to give you a little bit more information, Augie, is that we're adopting Panorama as our platform for student services, and that's going to allow us, so it will interact with Infinite Campus. So as we enter majors, minors, any kind of behavioral incident, it will also talk to Panorama. So they give us like basically a stoplight system around students of, if we're seeing like an increase in behavior, and then you can break it down into what specific types of behaviors, or if they're reporting they're not feeling safe at school, or they're not feeling regulated at school. Like, it gives us kind of a one-stop shop of all the information in Infinite Campus, so that we are really seeing patterns that wouldn't maybe jump out at you if you were just getting the one-off incidents, but rather it's having all of it in one place where it's going to identify, hey, there's a pattern emerging here and we need to do something about it. So that's something that I'm very excited about, and we're like up to our eyeballs, and Brian really is up to his eyeballs in making sure that our integration with Infinite Campus and Panorama is in place so that we can roll that out this year. So that, I think the combination of the new process around the bullying procedure and investigation combined with our Panorama integration and adoption is going to give us a much better lens on where we are with some of these things, so that we can respond differently and prepare differently.
The other nice thing about Panorama is it overlays that data, as Carrie was saying, with the survey the kids also take, the SEL survey and the well-being survey. So it gives you end grades and test scores, right, in attendance. So you get, you know, the student gets like 4 boxes, one for each one of those. And if all 4 are bright red, we have a student who needs a ton of help. But sometimes it also helps you find a student who's bright green, like academics and grades are on track. They're coming to school every day. They have 0 behavioral incidents, so those are all bright green. And then on the SEL survey, they're yellow or red, because they don't actually feel that great about school, because you want to make sure you're looking out for that student too, who's probably quietly kind of playing the game of school, but then it helps us to identify that's also a student who needs help. And whether it's related to bullying, or whether it's related to mental health issues, or whether it's just related to, I was really having a crud day the day I took the survey, it forces us to start having some of those conversations, so you don't miss a student who maybe is struggling, that's just a little quieter and usually kind of flies under people's radar.
It's a work in progress, but we're definitely moving in the right direction.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, we just have to keep moving forward,
Yep.
which is, and communicating, that transparency is so important. Yeah, awesome. Great job. Any other questions? Okay, ready for a motion. Andy, can you read the motion, please?
Can I ask you a question first? So what is it? I mean, we're just approving this last column of data. Is that what we're?
It's the report as a whole.
So just, I mean,
Yeah, technically it's the data chart is the actual report that you're.
this is the number of investigations that we
Yes.
did.
Yes,
So
well,
what
you're
reporting
approving
is-
it, it's the number of incidents of bullying, because we're working on documenting all the investigations.
Complaints come in, we say, yes, this is bullying. These are the actual numbers of the times we determined it was
Yes,
bullying.
correct.
And in the future, it will be,
This is how many reports we got. This is how many we're bullying. This is how many we're
I
kind
make
of.
sure I was clear on the numbers before.
Yes. Oh, you are.
Alright. I move that the board approve the 2023-24 annual bullying report as presented.
second.
Second.
Aye.
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 Simmons.
Aye.
Vega.
Aye.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Great work.